Welcome everyone to this new episode of the podcast. I have the pleasure today to have Robert Wilson. He's the CEO of Egg Medical. Welcome, Robert, to the podcast. Welcome, Robert, to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. You just froze, by the way.
Yeah, it's okay. Let's.
You start again?
I will just. Let's keep. We keep the recording. I'm just going to do it again. It happened a lot, typically at the beginning. So, okay. Welcome everyone to this new episode. I have the pleasure today to have Robert Wilson. He's the CEO of Egg Medical. Robert, thank you so much for accepting the invitation and welcome in this podcast.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, perfect. So we have a lot of things to discuss today. I'm very excited. We already had a first conversation together where we're going to discuss about some impact on the product development, the certification with the FDA, the fundraising. I mean, a lot of different topics which are extremely interesting. So let's start first with your background. I want to better understand where you come from and how did you become an entrepreneur.
Well, like most people, I wouldn't say exactly by accident, but definitely through a series of events that occurred. So I'm an interventional cardiologist. When I was a fellow, I was in a center where my research project was to develop a method for measuring blood flow in the arteries to the heart, and then to eventually use that in humans. And so I basically developed a Doppler catheter that measured blood flow in the heart blood vessels. And then I had to prove that it worked. So I developed an animal model. Of course, it didn't work. And then I went back and forth with some engineers. And eventually I got so tired of asking them to make modifications to the catheter that I just asked them to teach me how to make it, how to microsolder and all that. So I learned to work with small piezo crystals, and I developed a catheter, and then just for fun, I put two sensors on it, which you would only do actually if you were making it yourself, not if you were asking somebody else, but it was just for fun. And it turned out that the one on the side of the catheter worked great, and the one at the end, which was what we've been concentrating on, didn't work. And so we moved the sensor to the side of the catheter. That worked. That got through the validation studies. And then at that point, we wanted to use it in humans. And this was in the mid 80s, so things weren't quite as tight from a regulation standpoint. So I called up the FDA, and this is pre-internet, by the way. And I said, "Do I need a IND, an investigational device exemption, to use this in humans?" And this woman says to me, she says, "Well, if you think you need one, you definitely need one. And if you don't think you need one, you might." And so from that, you get paperwork, fill out all this paperwork. I send it in. I get 7 questions back. The first 6 were pretty technical. The 7th one is, you need to certify that this was done using good laboratory practices. And then there's a notation for the Code of Federal Regulations as to what that means. So I go to the law library, because again, pre-internet, look up this stuff, and we didn't do any of this stuff. And so, how am I going to answer that question? So I said, well, okay, we followed the spirit of GLP, and they took it. And then we began to do studies in humans. And I was in this small town, Iowa City, and we wanted to get this thing made commercially and approved. And the reality is, if you live in Iowa City, there is not a device manufacturing company in the world that wants to go to Iowa City, Iowa. And so basically I had zero uptake. I moved to Minneapolis subsequently, and the device was licensed within 3 months. So what that taught me from an entrepreneurial standpoint was, first of all, how to go through the process. How do you get from idea to thing, the thing that you test? You learn the regulatory process in real life, not in a PowerPoint slide. And then you also learn about the importance of location and getting other people to be interested in, and the power of location for that. So that's how I kind of got involved as an entrepreneur. And then, I was in Minneapolis working as an interventional cardiologist, and we got done with the case, and there was just a lot of tubing on the table. I mean, just tons of tubing, and it was very confusing. And I said, "Gosh, if we could just make the thing that you inject X-ray dye into the coronary arteries with, which is how you do an angiogram, and if you do an angioplasty or stent, you have to do this. If we could just make all this scattered up tubing into like a gas pump, where you would just basically push a button, the X-ray dye would come out, you stop the button, the machine would do all the valving and counting and all that stuff for you. And there was a guy next to us who was a salesman, and he says, you guys should start a company. And it was just that simple. And then light goes off, and a month later we started a company, and then, you got to learn, okay, so what is the thing? And there's always this period of probably 2 years, 3 years of what I call the Frankenstein, non-specific screwing around period, where you're just trying to figure out what it is. And that takes some time. And then you're trying to figure out what's the market for it. And also, patents and how you search for patents and find out whether you really have a clear pathway. And then, so you have to learn what else is in the market, and then how are you going to sell it? You have to learn all that stuff. And then eventually you got to raise some money. So kind of by doing that, you learn as you go. To a certain extent, but the key is just to be very persistent when you're doing it.
So that there's definitely like a lot of topic that I want to dive more, like all the different challenges that you've been listing here. Let's start with the beginning. Like, how do you find like the innovation, like in general? Because this is like an example that you just share for your first company, but at the same time, like you're currently CEO of Egg Medical, which is the second company. Is there like a pattern on or processes? How do you find those ideas?
Yeah, well, for me, there's a simple pattern in that, I'm a user, I'm a customer in a sense, and so everything that I've done have been products that I want but don't exist, and doesn't look like anybody's got the inclination to do it. And a lot of those are in areas that really haven't had any innovation for decades. In the case of what I'm doing right now, 50 years, no innovation. And those are areas that are very ripe. They're unrecognized fields. There's usually no competition because nobody's doing anything in that area. And it's an unrecognized market. And when maybe we'll talk about how you figure out market size, but when you think about a lot of these things, the market sizes are much, much larger than you think they are. They're just very fractionated because there's been no innovation, and you have a lot of little small providers providing little tiny things. But when you put it all together and you pull the market into a systematic device, then turns out that it's much bigger.
And typically, like when you have an idea and you believe in the use case, you believe that on the benefits of that product, is there a reason why there is no innovation in that specific niche? Is that because like within medical device, first, like building like a product is extremely expensive. You have to go through regulation. Everything adds up. How do you determine like the viability of an idea between like, okay, this is something useful, but this is something where there is a market, and at the same time which can be like a successful company?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, you don't, first of all, I don't enter a market where there's a lot of competition, because there are a lot of smart people out there. If you have 10,000 people thinking about a solution to a problem, there's very little likelihood that I'm going to be the one that's going to provide the solution for it. So it's usually an area where it's not available because it's not been thought of. And then, you're right. You have a lot of ideas. I have a lot of ideas anyway. Ideas are cheap, but a lot of them are useless, or they're not really practical to develop. And so the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what is the market size for this? And so I usually do it on the back of an envelope, in a very simple way, which is, what would I pay for that thing if it was available? How many procedures are there that would use that thing worldwide? And then you just do the math, the number of going to be used per year, you think, and the dollar amount of every one of those things, and you come to a market size. And, my experience has been that, that's usually plus or minus 30% of what the very complicated calculation is when people, spend $1 million on trying to figure out what the market size is, but you're within the ballpark, right? And so if your thing, has a total addressable market size of, less than a couple $100 million, it's not a company. It's a product. It's something that maybe you're going to develop, but somebody else is going to market. It's not worth building a company around it. If it's over $1 billion, great. Definitely worth building a market around it. If it's in between, it depends a little bit on what the total potential is for it. So in terms of time. So, you mentioned before about regulation. So if you've got something which has very little regulation, the market size could be a couple hundred million, and that might be worth building a company around because you're pretty quick to market. The cost of getting out is not that great. If you got a class 3 device, implantable, and the cost of development is going to be very large, then obviously that better be $1 billion market before you do it. So you do have to balance the quickness to market and the total development costs and the amount of money you're going to have to raise to do that with the total size of the addressable market. They've got to go lockstep one with the other.
Did you happen to learn that the hard way, meaning like trying to have like an idea, having an idea and trying to pitch that idea with, like VC angels, and realizing that those numbers and those feedback based on like errors that you made, or how that happened? How did you learn all of that?
Well, I kind of learned it on the fly, and it wasn't because I had an idea and the market size wasn't big enough to justify the development costs and the time and all that. It really was, it's pretty intuitive when you think about it. And when somebody kind of explains that to you for the first time, you begin to understand that. And I think for sure with my first company, there was some concern about market size. It was probably estimated to be about 300 million, and it was a class 2 device. So, probably 3 or 4 years to market, and, some regulatory stuff associated with it. But, so I became more sensitive to it then, but you just basically kind of learn the rules of the road from VCs and from strategics and even from some angel people that are very experienced in the business. I think, I mentioned location before, and so I'm in Minneapolis area, large collection of medical device companies here, large number of people very knowledgeable. So there's a lot of people that can help you and will educate you on this if you ask them. And, but again, if I was in an area like, I don't know, maybe Cincinnati or someplace, there's not much medical device there, I wouldn't have people like that around to help me. And what I found is, people will help you if you call them. People are incredibly generous with their time and knowledge. All you have to do is ask to do that. I always reminded that story about Steve Jobs, who called up, I can't remember what the guy, very famous guy in the semiconductor, Bill Packard, I think, and asked if he could get an oscillator or something, and the guy said absolutely. He didn't know this guy from anybody, right? But people, particularly people that are very accomplished, tend to be very helpful to people they think are genuine and are coming up in their industry.
Can you share like your feedback on how was your first fundraising, and especially like who did you go to talk with first? How did you raise like the first money? And depending on the type of investors, whether it's like angel, VCs, what's their expectation at each stage?
Yeah, this is the fundraising is the hardest part, and it's the hardest part to learn. I think particularly if you're a physician like me, or you have a technical background, you're an engineer, you're not wired to fundraise. You're not really, you don't. You have to learn the buttons, like you mentioned, of what their hot buttons are. So I would say initially we weren't very good. Put our own money in, and then we had a group of catheter reps who sold medical devices to cardiac cath labs, like where I work. And they had an investment club, and they put in $87,000, which was like, wow, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
But after that, I didn't have a long list of angels that I could call. So, we employed somebody who does have a list of angels, who's a professional fundraiser. It's a lot of money for those guys. They want to cut of the funds, 5 to 10%. They want usually some equity, 5 to 10% of what they raise in equity. So they're expensive, but if you don't have a list, that's what you have. And again, it goes to the location piece also, because if I was in Cincinnati, and I don't want to diss Cincinnati or anything, I don't really know much about the device community, but if you're in a place that doesn't have a medical device community, it's going to be tough to raise angel money, because you don't have people around you locally anyway that understand the market and that want to invest into that market because that's what they understand. Fortunately, in Minneapolis, we do have a lot of angels here who are medically device oriented, but you gotta find those people. And I think, you're probably going to have to get somebody who can do that for you, or at least help you. You're going to have to do the pitch to them, and they're really the Rolodex person and the trusted investment person that they have. So that was the first time. Now this last time, I did it myself because I knew people and I think they trusted me, and I had some success in the past. And so then, I really didn't need that kind of an intermediary. One of the other problems the intermediaries have is kind of like getting a real estate agent. And, that real estate agent just wants to sell the house. Whether you maximize your value on it, that's great if you do, but they want to get that commission and sell the house. So they tend to beat you down on valuation. So your company might be worth 10 million, but they want to raise it on a 5 million valuation because it's a lot easier for them. They're going to raise the same amount of money and they're going to get the same commission, whether it's a 5 million valuation or 10. So I think, that's one of the downsides of using a group like that. If you've got your own group, then you're going to get hopefully the valuation that you deserve. And I think the importance of, the other thing with the pitch deck, which I really, still irritates me a little bit that so much can rest on a pitch deck, but the reality is it does. And so you got to be able to get your message down to, 15 to 20 slides. And that's hard, I think, particularly for the entrepreneur, the developer, because you've got such a big story, you think, and to get that down to 15 slides for everything, it's a little bit tough, but you got to be able to do that.
Yeah, sounds good. Is there like a difference, especially like as you have like two experience, you have with two different products with different type of regulation on each, how that the type of regulation of this medical device impacts the feedback from investors and your capacity to raise the fund? What if that's related? Yeah.
Well, it's huge. It's huge. So you didn't mention my middle company. Actually, have three. The middle one, which also had a good exit, was a transcatheter valve company. So that's an implantable heart valve through a catheter. That's class 3 device, exclamation point. And so the timeline is important because investors are not investing for a dividend. They're investing to get their money back at a big multiple, hopefully. And the longer you hold their money, the worse it is for them. So it's got to have the bigger the payout has to be at the end, or potential payout. So, most people, there's really three classes of devices in the US and mostly for Europe too. A class 1 device, which my current one is, which is basically called self-certify, where you have to have a quality system in place, all this stuff, but there's not really a regulatory review for it. That's the best because you can go to market as soon as the product is developed and you've done your own internal testing. Class 2 device or 510K device, let's say. 510K device is one that requires review by the FDA, but the average review cycle is about 9 months. They have to respond to you within 6, and typically it's 6 months to a year before you get your final approval from them. And so that's not too bad. A PMA device or pre-market approval device is one that is an implantable device or something totally new, never been done before. And those devices typically have timelines, regulatory timelines of 2, 3, 4, 5 years. That require a large pivotal randomized trial. So the cost. So I always say, if you're doing a class 3 device, you better be a young person, because if you're an older person, you're never going to see, your relatives are going to see that money, but you're never going to see it. So obviously the question that most frequently gets asked in medical devices is this a 510K device? It's a 510K device, good. If it's a PMA device, then it better be a big device, and there better be a good chance that your company is going to be taken out or sold somewhere in that development process, because it's so good. A major strategic wants it, like a Medtronic or a Boston or somebody else, and that is usually what happens to class 3 devices when they're big. But everybody knows they're in for the ride if it's a class 3, whereas if it's a class 2, particularly class 1, it could be a relatively short-term investment with a good yield.
So can you sum that up very, very quickly? Class 1, class 2, and class 3 device, when do you expect, when does an investor expect to get in and get out, and what's the different timeline?
Yeah, it depends, of course, on a lot of things, but in general, it's a class 1 device. I think the investor thinks that they're going to get out within 3 years, maybe 4 at the most. If it's a class 2 device, anywhere from, again, probably 2 to 6 years, something like that. If it's a class 3 device, it might be 10 years before they get out. Probably average of less than that, because you'll sell early before you're actually a commercial product. But it's much easier to raise for the more lightly regulated devices than it is for the big, heavily regulated devices. And your likelihood of success also is higher. If you do a class 3 device, most class 3 devices wash out. They don't stand up a clinical trial. There's big development issues, or something happens. There's a lot of places for things to go wrong.
What's your okay? So now we've been talking on the investment side. Let's talk about like the technical side, the engineering side. I'm curious to try to get your feedbacks in terms of product development of those type of medical device. The different engineering challenges that you saw depending on the class of device or regulation.
Well, yeah, the first thing is you have to develop an engineering team that you trust and that is capable of doing imaginative development. And that takes a special kind of an engineer. And when you're a little tiny company, you can't really necessarily hire the best engineers in the world, because it requires a lot more money, a lot more infrastructure. So you've got to find a group of engineers, and particularly a lead engineer that is used to working in a small business environment, that is used to working without a lot of additional support, and who's capable of managing and developing at the same time. And as I said before, my experience has been that most of these go through this 2 to 3 year period of trying to figure out what the device actually is. So you have an idea, it's a broad idea, the device is going to do X, Y, and Z, but the embodiment of that idea and how you actually build it, that's a different story. So it takes time to be able to flesh all that out into a workable prototype. And then you end up with a Frankenstein prototype that, kind of works, and you can test, and if you have an animal model for it or some kind of cell, you can test it. And that's a proof of principle. And then you got to reduce that Frankenstein prototype to something that is commercially attractive for people, it's reliable, and, doesn't break, and it doesn't require a lot of, funky user input and the like. So you got to develop an engineering team that can do that. The device really determines, or the idea determines, what kind of engineers you need. So in some cases, you need just a simple set of mechanical engineers, you're done. That's unusual. In most devices, you require some very specialized engineering talent. So, for example, with the heart valve, we work with a metal called nitinol. Nitinol is a very funky metal and has a lot of weird characteristics. You have all the fatigue issues, so you have to have somebody that can do very sophisticated fatigue analysis, computer analysis, somebody that knows a lot about nitinol. There's a lot of other things. So the one I'm in right now, which is radiation protection or radiation shielding, it's a little easier. Those materials things are pretty well known. You're really interested in an engineer who's got a good mechanical background, understands consumer needs, et cetera. And then, finally, for my first device, it's an electromechanical device. You got to have electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, people that know about disposables. And so at some point, you're going to come up and you've got the product, right? With whatever engineering team you have. The next thing you do is you have to manufacture that product. And everybody, says, if you talk to most people, doctors, even engineers sometimes, they'll say, well, the idea is the biggest piece. And then the development is number two, and manufacturing, that's just grunt work. Everybody can manufacture. And I would say it's almost in reverse of that. Manufacturing is really hard. It's very easy. Well, it's easy, but to make the Frankenstein thing, that you can do. But to make a finished good product with good quality and reliable quality throughout the process, and make a lot of them, that is actually really, really hard to do. And so I tell people there's thousands of ideas. There's no shortage of ideas for things. So the idea is not that valuable. There's a lot of people that can make one of anything, but the group that can make 1 million of something repeatedly, how many people can do that? So that part is really tough.
Can you dive down on the customer feedback? How did you manage to, once you have your Frankenstein products, try to iterate to like the final version, the last version? How did you do with each of the different products?
Yeah, I would even take it one step further than that. And before you even get to the Frankenstein product, I've always found that just going and talking to customers, potential customers, repeatedly is the most helpful consumer feedback that you have in the development process. So, for example, for my first device, I went to 10 cath labs in Europe. One with my wife. We landed in Amsterdam. We went to a cath lab every day, and I wanted to see what the layout was. And I had a set of questions for them about, what they're currently spending on what they're doing and what they thought of the idea and each aspect of the idea, which had value, which didn't have value. Super repetitive. I mean, every morning you're up at 7 a.m. and you're out the door and in these cath labs and you ask the same question every day, but super informative. I mean, by day 5, you begin to see a pattern, and it tremendously changes where you place the value. So on the current thing I'm working on, initially this thing was going to start out as a mattress that people lay down on, and the mattress would take all your vital signs without many wires. And so when a patient was going to be in the operating room or a procedure room, instead of having all these wires all over the patient and everything, blood pressure cuffs, basically you would plug in the mattress, not the patient. That was kind of the thing. So I went to 15 cath labs in Europe and 15 in the United States. And I sat down with the nurse manager and with the lead doctor and an administrator, and I went through these questions, and, I explained it, and I said, well, and they said, basically, do you want this? And they said, oh yeah, kind of, that's pretty good. Yeah, I kind of like that. That's good. And I said, well, how much do you think it'd be worth? And they said, well, I think like $7,000. Okay, well, that's not going to do it because it's going to cost more than that probably to make this thing, right? So then no, that's not very good. So in the patent, we had radiation protection as well for the staff, because when people are in X-ray rooms, the staff in the room get radiated every day. And so I said, well, what if we could cut down the radiation by half? Oh my God, that'd be fantastic, and that's worth $15,000 or $20,000, $30,000. And what if we could do 90% reduction? And then it was like, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000. And what if we do 99%? It'd be, oh my God, I'd pay anything for that. It doesn't matter what it is. So it became very clear after even the first several interviews that is where the market saw the value. And so we pivoted to radiation protection. And right now we're kind of resetting the standard for radiation protection in all these hospital labs. And then, you have to think about what's the market. And so I did the same thing we just talked about. I said, well, there's about 25,000 of these labs. This is what I think they'll pay for it. Oh my God, that's over a $2 billion market. And by the way, it's a class 1 device. Okay, that checks all the boxes, right? If I had not done that survey, that customer survey, never would have done this. So that's very helpful. And then once you develop something, again, a lot of times I'll just show people that I know, and I'm fortunate because I'm a physician, so I can easily show a lot of people stuff. But I don't send out an email survey. I don't do an internet survey. I sit down with them and I show them and I ask them, because that's when you're going to get the real feedback from people. And it's amazing. I mean, a lot of times they just throw up on it, So I remember I had this control screen for something, touch control screen for the sterile field. And it was like, oh my God, so many people threw up on it. And what you learn is you just keep going back, well, how about this, and you end up with something that is simple. And what you learn is you got to simplify everything, because although you're making a medical device and you think it's the star in the room and everybody's paying attention to this thing, the reality is vast majority of medical devices need to go into the background. They're just another person working in that room. So just like with any other person, you got to trust it. Otherwise, you don't want to work with it, so you kick the device out, and you don't want to be bugged by it. So it's there to do a job, but not to be the star in the room. And so that's why everything has to be so simple. I think when you develop it, and then you also have to be a little bit jaundiced in how you view the feedback. I know. So I'm not a fan of focus groups. We had a hand controller for the first device that controlled how you injected contrast dye into the arteries so you can see them on X-ray. And it needs to be precise and variable flow. So the more you activate it, the faster the contrast comes out. And so we had all these controllers. We had a whole bunch of game controllers, and we lined them up for everybody. And people picked a gas pump because they thought, oh, just like pumping gas, this would be great. So we launched the product with a gas pump, and everybody hated it. I mean, it was uniform, intense dislike. And so,
Really?
within 2 months, we had completely redesigned that to a little tiny handpiece, which everybody loved. And I remember we had one very famous cardiologist who we had as an advisor, and I showed him the gas pump thing, and he goes, okay. And I showed him the other one, he goes, wow, really nice. But you're there in person, you can see the difference in the face between, which you might have written okay on a form, but when you're there in person, you see the difference. And that's why I think it's important to do these surveys in person. And to a certain extent, it's important for the founder or the CEO to be in that process of doing it, because you get a lot of stuff back from your sales team or whatever. And, salespeople, they have to be positive, right? You would shoot yourself if you were a salesperson and you were a
Clear.
positive, because you get a lot of negative feedback. So they tend to report overly positive data to you. So you've got to be there to really see it for yourself, I think, and not rely on other people or surveys or, whatever. It's very impactful. So that's how I collect data.
It's honestly that's amazing, and I just want to dive more into the way you identify the issue for the radiation exposure for ex-medical. So through those surveys, it's great to share that. Can you elaborate like a little bit more on the problematic itself? Why do we have those doctors which are basically exposed, I mean, overexposed to radiation, with potentially like less control that I
Yeah,
think you were
well,
mentioning?
it's not just doctors, it's nurses and technicians, because nobody does these procedures all by themselves. So, the problem is that X-ray, as it developed, and this, everybody knows this, really was thought to have no effect until turns out it had a huge negative effect on human health, from cancer to cataracts to skin disease and all this stuff. So in hospitals, in general, there is not a culture of employee safety, and there never has been. If you get a needle stick and you get hepatitis from a patient, then the general feeling is that's your fault. You're a bad person because you got a needle stick. If you hurt your back lifting something, you're a bad person because you didn't, take care of your back or whatever. And by the same token, if you got a radiation-related illness, you're a bad person because you didn't use whatever minimal shielding they had. That's just a cultural aspect, and that's changing in a big way right now. But that's always been the culture. And so, until we really pivoted to radiation, I never really thought about it very much. But in reality, I know 2 people that have had radiation-related mortalities, both with cancer, both almost certainly based on the kind of cancer they had, hematologic malignancies, was related to their X-ray exposure. And what I learned was that everybody in my profession knows somebody with a radiation-related disease. Everybody, whether it's cataracts or cancer, a lot of cancer, cardiovascular disease. There was a guy in St. Paul, I think, who had a melanoma on his foot, which gets a huge dose of radiation on the top of his foot.
Wow.
So, I began realizing that this is a much bigger problem than I thought it was. And part of it's because of this culture of minimizing occupational health issues in medicine, even though medicine has the highest occupational health problems of any profession. And then you begin to realize that physicians that work in these environments have the highest radiation exposure of any profession in the world, 2.5 times that of a nuclear power plant worker. Two and
Wow.
a half times. And yet, if you go into a hospital, will you find a radiation meter? No. You
Yeah.
won't find any. If you go to a nuclear power plant, will you find one? Everywhere, and everybody's wearing one. They're everywhere. And that tells you just a little bit about the culture. So this seemed like a solvable problem, right? I mean, you've got millions of healthcare workers who are being radiated every day in their job. We know there's a 3-fold increase in cancer, mainly brain cancers, thyroid cancers, and hematologic malignancies. A 6-fold increase in cataracts, not a little increase, 6-fold increase in cataracts, and a 2-fold increase in cardiovascular disease, because the inner lining of blood vessels is very sensitive to radiation. So you have these people, they're being radiated every day, they're getting these diseases, and then how do we deal with this? Well, we know that we have to have a better shielding system. So that's a big mechanical engineering project. Well, okay, I think I can do that. We can figure that out. The second thing is it's got to be so successful that at least you have to have a meaningful impact. So we chose 90%. We have to have a 90% reduction in the dose to everybody in the room, not just the doctor, but everybody. And then the third thing is it can't get in the way of the workflow. Because in reality, if the shielding's in your way, the patient care is the number one thing happening in that room. Then shielding's got to go out of the way in order to take care of the patient. So we met all three of those. And we got to a 90% reduction. And then what people told us was what they really wanted to do is they wanted to take their lead apron off. Because all these people wear lead aprons, which are modestly effective, but they also cause back problems. These lead aprons, they're pretty heavy. People wearing them all day. They get back problems. They get neck problems. There's a guy in this country who recently, an older guy who was basically a quadriplegic from the apron causing C-spine disease. So we're at 99.4% reduction in X-ray dose. So we are at a point where people could take their apron off in the room. So that's very gratifying, to really change an environment like that. But it took a while to get there and a lot of Frankenstein prototypes.
I have a question, like because every medical device needs to go through the FDA, the regulation, and why the radiation protection requirement is not directly put on the medical and the imaging equipment that emit the radiation to try to basically protect directly like the user directly from on the equipment itself.
Yeah, Jeremy, that is a terrific question. and I'll take an opinion. Okay. I don't know why, but right now the law in the United States, and for the most part in Europe also, there is almost no regulation of shielding devices. There is regulation of personal protective equipment. So aprons, if you wear it, then it's regulated, although it's very lightly regulated. If you wear a cap, as long as you don't wear it, there's no regulation. The responsibility for hospital worker safety in this respect in the United States is by state. So every state has a health department. Every health department has some mandates about what kind of protection needs to be provided in those labs. It's the hospitals that are regulated to provide that protection. It's not the manufacturer's responsibility in the U.S. And why is that? Well, I think part of it is the reason we just talked about, and that is that healthcare is focused on the patient. The FDA does care about patient dose. And so manufacturers are responsible for patient dose, but they're not responsible for collateral damage from all the scatter radiation that they create. And because of that, there's really no attention for the most part given to it. But it is something, for example, for Egg Medical, if I were an X-ray company, I would be incorporating what we have into their system. And because that would make sense, and frankly, I would sell a lot more X-ray machines, I think. But this focus on the patient, not on the worker, I believe is the real reason for that. But the reality is, in almost nowhere in the world is it regulated like it probably should be.
Yeah. So basically, you need to basically go to each hospitals and prove the use case, the use of your product, to make sure that you get like a market, like some users which are interested in the product, before being able to, in order to show that there is a need, that there is like people that want to be protected and potentially move things up, right? That's the strategy.
Yep. Yeah. So there's really, fortunately for us, and part of it's because Egg's available and a few other products or newer products are available. The awareness that something needs to be done is there. It's kind of like the asbestos problem, probably 40, 50 years ago. Everybody knew asbestos was bad, but there was a turning point where it went from being asbestos is bad to we got to get rid of asbestos. And so we're kind of doing that turning point now. It's driven by two things. One is younger people that are coming into the professions, and they don't like risk. They're much less risk tolerant probably than the older generation was of risk. And there are more women coming into these areas as well. And women don't like cancer and all the risks associated with that. The second thing is we got a lot of old men. And these old men who are still in practice have been wearing lead all their life, and their backs have had it, and their hips have had it from all the weight. And so they want to get rid of their lead. The young people want to get rid of the risk. The old people want to get rid of the lead. But together, they know that they need a new system, that something has to be done about this. So we're at a turning point for this. And, nobody cares about a problem unless there's a solution. There's a lot of things wrong with this world, but there's not a good solution, and so we don't talk about it. But once a solution becomes available, then it's something that you really have to think about, and you have to figure out how you're going to incorporate that solution to reduce your risk. And that's where we're at right now, which is a great place for ag, of course, because we are the solution for this, and we're able to solve both problems. The back problem by getting rid of the lead, and the risk problem by just generally getting rid of all the radiation.
So the users are really like the one really pushing for the adoption of the product.
Yes. Yeah. And so because it's not something you can bill for, to an insurance company, it really is related to the acquisition and retention of staff, and to avoid the problems of staff illness and staff cancer and et cetera. So as you might imagine, we have a big push from practitioners and users. We have a push from frontline managers because these are their people. They report to them. And the pushback really comes more in the back office from the CFO and from other people because, they're not getting radiated and they see this as a cost, not so much as a revenue generator.
So can you share a little bit more insight of like your strategy, and as well like potentially like growth and exit strategy, and as well like I would like to get like your feedback on in general, like when a medical device company want to exit, what type of acquisition they can have, strategy, VC, private equity, etc. So
the most common exit for companies like us and medical device companies in general is acquisition by a strategic, by a larger company. When you think about, the bigger companies, Abbott, J&J, Medtronic, Boston Scientific, the big companies in our sphere, those companies are predominantly sales and marketing distribution organizations. And at some point, they just acquire more and more products. So they would be basically we would be a product that they would acquire. And the same is true of X-ray companies, right? Which I think, if you look at acquisition strategy, from my perspective, the most logical acquisition would be by an X-ray company. They would just incorporate it into their device. They would have all of a sudden a X-ray system that doesn't develop scatter radiation, and to the user, to their customer, that is super attractive, and I think would add a substantial piece of margin to what they're selling right now, in addition to more market share. So that would be a very logical extension for that, but usually it's to some strategic. That's the most common. Another option is like a private equity firm that would put us together with like size company, a monitoring company, or somebody else in the radiation protection zone to create a bigger package of radiation protection. And that does happen. My understanding is that the multiples that are paid for that, the multiples of earnings or revenue that are paid for that are, usually quite a bit lower than if a strategic were to acquire you, because the strategic really is interested in maximizing their product line. And so you might have a synergistic effect with their product line. And then, of course, you can do an IPO. Not many people are doing IPOs these days in the med tech world, but at least in the medical device world. But, certainly, definitely it does happen. And there have been quite a few successful ones. I think from an investor standpoint, I can't speak for all investors, but most of them would prefer an acquisition because it's easier to get their cash out at that point. And that's their main concern. They're renting you the money in a sense. And they want to get that money back at some point. The earlier, the better for them.
Thank you so much, Robert, for sharing everything today, like all those feedback, those insights. It was extremely useful. Maybe like the last question for the end is really like discussing about like your current strategy, the upcoming milestones that you have, and anything else that you want to share.
Yeah, well, we're building the company out now, so we're commercial. And this year, we want to sell a significant number of devices, but our real goal is to dominate this market. And so we know it's a $2 billion market. We're not going to dominate that overnight, of course, but we've got a product now which we think meets almost all of the customers' initial needs, and then we want to build out that platform with additional functionality on it, which is pretty substantial when you think that you are taking up the whole space of an operating table. There's a lot of stuff you can put on that operating table. It would be super helpful for the people that work there. And so building out that product portfolio is important for us. And at the same time, building out the sales force. But right now, our goal is really to get the platform out there, to prove its usefulness, and basically to set the fire for additional sales next year. I think at some point, we're likely to have some kind of an event occur, whether it's next year or the following year, the year after. I don't really know. I know that the best course for us is to build the best business that we can, and persistence is a lot of that, and just putting one foot in front of the other in order to build out this company so that we can have the biggest footprint possible. And then at the end of the day, yes, investors want their money back, and there's a good chance that this company will be incorporated into something else. But I think the biggest thing for us to do right now is just to go forward, and we want to be the leader in the field. We want to have the most science-based products. We want to have the most data, and we want to have the most professional sales force. So, we're just building that. Does it take money? Yes, it does take money. Will it take more money? It might take more money, but at the end of the day, my feeling is that if you concentrate on building the best business, you're going to get the best return.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Robert, again. Really, really appreciate that you took the time to share all of that today together. Thank you again.
Well, you're very welcome, and thanks for inviting me again.